Hi, my name is Tommy Stinson, and I want to talk for a few minutes about revealing the truths around sex. The topic of the conversation this morning is about forging a seat at the table. And what I'd like to do is argue that until we're able to reevaluate the fundamentals of how we approach insights work, we will fail at our attempts to gain a seat at the table. We've seen a lot of innovations and new approaches and new methodologies over the last 10, 15, 20 years in terms of how we speak to consumers and how we understand who they are and what they think. But I'd like to argue that we actually haven't done a very good job of taking a look at the assumptions and the structures that underlie the research that we're doing. We would never say that traditional market research is bad. That would be foolish with this audience, but it would also be hypocritical. So traditional market research, focus groups, and ethnographies and being in field, it's a key piece of what I do on a day-to-day basis. It's a huge part of our business. I think the challenge comes, though, when we try to take traditional market research approaches and apply them to non-traditional questions. So we would argue that new questions require new approaches and new techniques and really a fundamentally new structure for how we consider what we do. We're hearing a lot of questions around how do we get new insights from old questions. So we have clients saying, I've heard all of this before. I'm not hearing anything new. This is the same old, and I really need to uncover new insights to drive my business success. And so if you think about questions like health, how do we inspire new conversations around health? Cleanliness, how do we have consumers say something new around cleanliness? We also have difficult topics and topics that not just it's hard to think creatively about, but topics that we know consumers have difficulties articulating with people that they don't know well, like sex. So we approached last year Trojan condoms and said we would like to pilot a new approach to uncovering fresh truth and new insight. And in the course of that pilot, what we'd like to do is take a look at some of the traditional assumptions of how we do qualitative insights, and we'd like to figure out which ones of them we might bend and which ones we might break in order to uncover something that you haven't heard before around one of your segments. So they were looking at a particular segment of their audience, and we had heard them say before, there's nothing new here. Consumers are saying the same thing about their sexual attitudes and their sexual behaviors and their sexual needs that they've been saying for the last 20 years. So what I'd like to do is take you very quickly through the approach, but spend the majority of our time talking about what we learned through the course of this work. So this is just a quick rundown of what we did. This particular segment is primarily couples, primarily heterosexual couples. But we brought them together in a very nice loft space. We spent an extensive amount of time with them over the course of an evening. We had wine and we had appetizers and snacks after work. And we basically introduced the topic and said, we want to talk about sex. This is going to be uncomfortable, and that's okay to be uncomfortable. We're going to ask you to do some things that might feel a little bit strange, but we're going to be right there with you doing them, so please trust us and go along with this. We then split them up into single-sex groups. So I moderated a session, and my colleague Lindsay Adams moderated a session. And we spent that first evening just really getting to know them. There wasn't a strict agenda. There wasn't a really robust, thought-through guide. We just wanted to begin to understand what is their sexual being, what is their sexual world like, and who are they. We immediately launched a month-long online community with these same respondents, and we spent the month asking them to journal about every sexual encounter that they had, whether it was alone or with a partner. We gave them questions and exercises and just different ways to keep them engaged, but also to understand things like, what's your sexual past like? What's your sexual present? What's your sexual future? Again, just ways to continue to keep them engaged. Over the course of that community, we also spent time with them in their homes. So we visited each of the respondents in their homes, and we spent about 3 to 4 hours, really open-ended. We basically said, give us an afternoon, and we just want to come and spend time with you and understand more of who you are. And we also want to go shopping with you. So we took them to a relatively high-end sex store in San Francisco, not the seedy sort of peep show sex shops that you might think of when you hear sex shops. But we gave them money and said, we'd like you to buy something in the store that you're willing to integrate into your sexual repertoire, and then we'd like you to blog about it and tell us how that works or doesn't work. And then once this community was over and we had done all these visits, we brought everyone back into the same facility for a more detailed conversation around brands and products and services, but also just to debrief and say, how was this process for you? How did this process work for us? And what did we learn? So, what did we learn? There really are 4 key areas that I want to touch on. The first is about the role of the moderator and what we saw really working to drive fresh conversations with consumers. The second area is about the time that we spend with consumers and how that time might need to change. The third is around boundaries and the ability or lack of ability to push boundaries with respondents and make them a bit uncomfortable. And the fourth is about storytelling. So moderators. The first thing we learned was that moderators, the old model of a moderator standing up at the head of a class almost really, with a clipboard and a guide, talking people through a specific set of questions with a very defined amount of time, is not effective for the types of questions that were now being asked. When we acknowledge that there's a wall between respondents and moderators, and we make actual, real efforts to break that wall, we began to see really deep conversations. So we began to act as what we called participant moderators, and we sat down alongside the respondents, we sat with them. In some ways, we led the conversation. Without leading the respondents, we demonstrated through our own divulgences and our own willingness to be vulnerable, the tone and the tenor of the conversations that we hope to have. We also learned that we can't get deep truth in a 2-hour focus group, and that's not surprising, and I know that there's a bit of preaching to the choir on this, but because we had such extensive amounts of time with them, we had an amazing freedom to be able to digress and explore and think differently about how we wanted to ask questions. And this required our clients to be comfortable saying, we know that you're going to improvise, and that's okay. We know that you're not going to cover off on everything that we'd like to cover off on. That's okay. There's a deeper purpose here. The third finding was around boundaries, and I think that the truth is that because we spent so much time with people and because we got to know them better, we were able to make them a little uncomfortable. And we were able to say, again, this is an awkward conversation, and it's okay to be awkward, and please, we're feeling awkward too, so just bear with us. But I think when you push people's boundaries, when you stretch them, when you put them in slightly uncomfortable positions, they begin to think and express themselves differently. And we really saw that very clearly in this. If you've ever seen, I don't know if you have, but ever seen a single man walking through a sex store with 2 people following him, asking him questions, that is an illustration in discomfort. But because he was so uncomfortable, he was able to say, this is really what I'm feeling. I liken this to friends who argue, and you try to be polite, and you try to be nice, and you try to be accommodating, and in any good relationship, ultimately there comes a time when you start to butt heads, and that's when people say things that they really mean. That was the same dynamic that we saw here. And finally, stories. I think we found that when we think about the ways that the insights need to land in our organization and a client's organization, before we get into field, we're able to more effectively structure our research. The days of delivering big, heavy stack of PowerPoint slides, we all know that those are gone. I think what we saw was that we literally can't afford to wait to deliver amazing amounts of data, because the insights and the energy that comes around approaches like this, and the insights and the energy that come around new questions and new findings gets lost when you take weeks and weeks and weeks. So we spent a lot of time with videographers. We began to think like filmmakers, like documentarians, and the stories that came out were much richer, and we were able to convey some of the energy around the field experience. We saw great results. The client was very happy, so we proved our approach worked. But I think what we saw was, firstly, new conversations. So we saw that because we had this ability to spend time with people, we began to hear things that we didn't expect. And after 2 groups, so remember that this group of consumers was together once at the beginning of the month, and they were only together again at the end of the month. But by that last conversation, The men in my group were saying, this feels like therapy. I've never talked to guys like this before. I don't talk to my best friends about sex like this. This is amazing. We saw similar levels of excitement and discussion with the women, and we saw the conversations changed within the partners as well, where they knew that they were talking about sex with other people, so it gave them an opportunity to say, what did you guys talk about in your conversations? They knew they were blogging about the sex that they had had the night before, so they were able to say, gosh, what did you write about last night? How was that? And we were able to uncover new territories for the client, which ultimately was where we wanted to go. We wanted to be able to say, there's an opportunity for your brand to play a bigger role here, and here's where that is. So I'll just leave with the challenge. 10 minutes is not a lot of time to talk about this. I'm really passionate about it, and I would love to have additional conversations with anyone who's interested. But I do think that in order to secure the seat at the table, we need to be fast, and we need to be bold, and we need to be willing to think differently about how we do what we do. Thank you.